Welcome all to our discussion on the recent history of midterm elections with Dr. Fred Beuttler. We are very excited to welcome you here to our university virtually. My name is Seth Green, and on an afternoon like this one, I'm especially proud to say I'm the dean here at the Graham School at the University of Chicago, and I welcome you to our gorgeous campus, which is slightly more cloudy on this afternoon than it shows up here on what was a beautiful spring day. We are the Graham School, which is the gateway to the incredible ideas of this university for curious adults everywhere. And we are now 132 years into this mission, the first of its kind in our country, to extend the big ideas of a university to all learners and to really make sure that the cutting edge ideas that are here at the university are accessible and are influencing our society at large. For those of you who are not familiar, we are proud to have 4 domains of programming. Our Master of Liberal Arts, which is among the most rigorous and respected in the world, where you look across all of the divisions of the university and can essentially become a master across those different areas. We have a basic program where you're able to immerse yourself in what are often called the great books of Western social and political thought in a classroom that is committed to the Socratic tradition. We have open enrollment where you can look across all of the disciplines through non-credit learning, where you're able to just experience the joy of knowledge and camaraderie with others. And then we have an annual set of programs that allow you to better know Chicago and even deepen your understanding of the future of museum publishing. But the reason that you are here today, and let me stop sharing my screen and spotlight our speaker, is to hear from one of those great instructors, Dr. Fred W. Beuttler, who received his PhD in history from the University of Chicago and went on to become the deputy historian of the US House of Representatives. How would you like to figure out how to tell our history with 435 people that have politically charged and different viewpoints? So no easy role. And then later went on to another awesome role, in my opinion. He was the associate dean here at the Graham School, where we had the pleasure of his leadership for numerous years. And now we have the joy of calling him an instructor of many courses. I would name them, but all of them at this moment have wait lists as we look forward to autumn. So I'd be making you jealous. But the most exciting is he'll be teaching numerous sections of an America's Contested History sequence that will look at how we make sense of the multiple interpretations of our history and the reckoning that we are going through as a country. But the reason we scheduled this conversation is that we are coming up to a midterm election. And we thought, who better than the former deputy historian of the House of Representatives to give us a little bit of a history lesson on midterms that have preceded this moment. And while I know Fred could talk about hundreds of years of midterms in this country, we are primarily locating this discussion on the last 3 decades. But maybe, Fred, just to start by laying the broad historical foundation for our audience, can you talk a little bit about the first midterm election and at a high level, how midterm elections have evolved in US history to this point? And then we'll dig in to the last 3 decades in particular.
Good, thank you, Seth, and thank you for that introduction. It was sort of humbling to sort of see what far back, because I became deputy historian of the House in 2005 and stayed through 2010, right after that midterm election. So I got 2 midterm elections in the middle. I was there for the 109th, 110th, and 111th Congress. And maybe to start off, I wanted to sort of talk a little bit about how the founders set up the political system. And one of the things I like to do is the founders, or how our constitutional framework is set up, is there's a unique part of what I call political time in the United States. What is the main unit of political time? It's not the year, it's the Congress. And as we know, and every 2 years, there's a different Congress. And so our even numbered years are always an election year. Our odd numbered years are always the other year, right? And so we could see this. There's a cycle that we see. And I kind of want to look at how the founders sort of set up the three political branches of the American constitutional framework, the president, the House, and the Senate. And so the House will serve for one Congress. The president will serve for two Congresses. A senator will serve for three Congresses. And if a president is reelected, they'll serve for four Congresses. That's four Congresses, that's 8 years. And what to think about it, though, a president's first Congress is quite a bit different than his second Congress, different than his third Congress, and different than his fourth Congress. And so we think about it, the president has the most political capital, if you will, on his first Congress. The second Congress, they're running for re-election. And so less political capital, less ability to focus on really major policy issues. The third Congress, after his re-election, that will be one that he can do something, kind of you can sort of go in the power, A, C, B, D, if you can kind of look at that as sort of see what the significance of it. And by the time you get to a president's fourth Congress, everybody is not paying attention at all to that president's agenda because you're moving on to the next major election. And so to think about it in that way, that's one important thing to think about as we look at the question of what a midterm election is. A second thing that we want to look at is the idea of separation of powers, that the president is elected on different constituencies than the House and then the Senate. And because of that, there's a possibility of divided government. You can have a president of one party, a Senate of another party, and a House of maybe the president's party or another party. So it's seldom that you have the three political branches connected, that sort of political trifecta. Whereas if you look in, say, a parliamentary system like in England, you see a working majority of the majority party that is in place for, the term of the parliament, either 3 to 5 years that's there. And so the idea of having divided government is built into our constitutional framework. And it's the founders' intent on some of that, to really dampen the sort of possibilities of major swings. And so when you think about this, if you have a parliamentary election in England, for example, you could have one single day a majority into Labour or the Tory party, and that will be in effect really for the next 5 years. Whereas in the United States, you have really only the possibility of a 2-year period without another election to check the possibility of concentrated power. So that's built into the system. There's a couple things as well to think about it that we may want to take a look at in thinking on this, partly because the founders weren't anticipating parties. There is a deep suspicion on the part of the founders of parties or factions. But by George Washington's first midterm election, that's going to be in 1790, you start to see, you don't have parties yet, but you have a pro-administration group and an anti-administration group. And that will develop into the first party system of the Federalists versus the Democratic Republicans. But already you're seeing opposition to the president's agenda, or maybe in this case, Alexander Hamilton's agenda. But you're already seeing this by the first midterm election in Washington's administration in 1790. So it gets early that you start to see the significance of midterm elections. Just as one thing I always like to mention, I have a little bit of a military history background, and maybe as a student rather than someone who serves, but I grew up looking at the Civil War and thinking deeply about the Civil War. And it hit me as you look at political time in the United States that military historians think the Gettysburg Campaign or the Vicksburg Campaign, taking place in July, the first few days in July of 1863, was the turning point in the war. And thinking about it, no, it can't be. It can't be the turning point in the war because it's in 1863. It's an odd numbered year. that's not a significant year, because even if it's a major Union defeat, you still have over a year to recover. But in this case, the anniversary, and we're coming up to the 160th anniversary, I think, of the Battle of Antietam. The Battle of Antietam, and I believe it was September 17th, 1862. That's 6 weeks before the midterm election. That is a critical battle. And you can see that one of the things that Abraham Lincoln does after the sort of victory, it wasn't a strategic victory, but let's say a tactical victory for the Union forces. What Lincoln did is he realized, as a campaign issue to sort of shape what the war is, as the result of the tactical victory of the Union in the Battle of Antietam, he actually announced the Emancipation Proclamation, designed to shape the electoral outcome of the 1862 campaign. So that's a critical midterm election, as you see it, as sort of watch of how the process of political time works even in the midst of the Civil War. And to me, it's talks about, sort of speaks to the resilience of the American political system, that in the middle of the most existential crisis, constitutional crisis of Civil War, the United States not only will have a midterm election in 1862, but actually put the war on the ballot in 1864, because here Abraham Lincoln is running against George McClellan as a peace candidate. There you could see the significance of that political time, even in the midst of a constitutional crisis. So that's sort of one thing to think about as we look at the significance of midterm elections, because if a president loses his midterm election, loses a working majority, he's very much limited as to what he can do. A couple things also as to sort of see what this political time is like. Very seldom are presidential elections fought over foreign policy issues. That's where the president has the most flexibility, because he doesn't necessarily have to deal directly with Congress or through Congress to pass specific types of legislation. But you'll notice, like this cycle, a president's first Congress, usually it's the case, he has a major domestic agenda. His second Congress, he'll pull back a little bit and emphasize foreign policy. When he's reelected, that third Congress, it is again a domestic agenda. And then in the fourth Congress, you'll see a president pivot, and this is generally, but pivot to foreign policy, where he has the most flexibility in operation. So we can kind of watch and feel this cycle as we work our way through, and use this as a template to understand the significance of midterm elections. So maybe that's a good way to start, at least of some of the significance of some midterms. And I could add a few more, but maybe Seth wants another follow-up question.
Well, it's a brilliant way to start. And I have to say, as someone who has studied and who has been in classes, I'm amazed at how much I constantly learn from you, Fred, because I have obviously thought about this 2-year cadence, but I've never been able to see how it influences all of these other factors, like what's on the agenda, how it's on the agenda, who has influence and power. And obviously, if you're a presidential strategist, how it's going to influence how you look at what you're going to accomplish during your presidency. I just want to put one other issue on the table before we jump into the recent history of these midterms, which is about who votes in these elections. Because as you know, it is different than who's voting in number and in type than in the presidential elections. And I just think that's an interesting, kind of context point to be aware of as we then jump into the specific elections that have happened over the last 30 years. So who's voting? How does that differ from what you might see in the presidential elections?
That's a very good question, and you can sort of watch and see what the strategy is, for example, for actually the most recently, and I'm not going to do it in partisan terms, but I'm just going to describe a few things of what the party that holds the presidency usually does. And here you've watched Mr. Biden realize over the last few months, trying to figure out how to increase his base. And rather than move to the middle, he's moved towards strengthening the base to mobilize them to turn out for the midterm election. So overall, you're going to have a much larger percentage of the electorate is going to vote during a presidential election. And usually, especially when there is you usually will have it when there are two candidates, neither of which is an incumbent. Whereas when the re-election will take, or when there's someone's up for re-election, sometimes, and usually the case, except for in 2020, but usually the case is it's slightly less than the first election. But it's usually a much broader electorate for the general election than the midterm election. So as we look and see, looking to 2022, it's oftentimes the most mobilized base of each of the parties will turn out rather than the broad middle, let's say. But in a presidential election or a presidential election year, it's usually much higher in the percentages of the electorate. So as you look towards the 2020 election, a midterm election, a critical midterm, and I want to talk a little bit before about a couple other patterns. But then we can talk very closely about the last 30, since the 1994 election. That was one of the critical midterm elections. But maybe here, I wanted to talk about a couple midterm elections before we get into the more recent past, because some of it has some major effect on American foreign policy or American domestic policy. And so if we go back to the administration of Woodrow Wilson, he is elected in 2012 as a third party minority candidate, because the Republican vote is split between Taft and the bull moose Roosevelt. Wilson wins re-election in 2016. 1916. But then the midterm election in 1918, just a few days before the armistice at the end of the First World War, then Wilson will lose his working majority in the Senate. And that will be a very important loss for Wilson, that Wilson will have to struggle with, especially to get the passage of the Versailles Treaty through the Senate, because he had lost his working majority in the Senate. There is you sort of see a pattern during the 1930 election. The Republicans had dominated in 1920, 1924, 1928, but the 1930 election is a midterm election, and it takes place about a year after the Wall Street crash in 1929. And here, the president's party, Herbert Hoover's party, loses a significant amount of seats, actually enough to shift one of the chambers. And then that sets up this landslide that Franklin Roosevelt is going to do in the 1932 election. So that's going to be a very important sort of precursor to a major change that will take place that brings in the Roosevelt majority. But now if we go back, there's seldom, as a pattern, there's seldom times that in a president's first term that they don't lose seats. The president's party doesn't lose seats in that first midterm election, moving from a president's first Congress to his second Congress. One of the exceptions is going to be the 1934 election. And if you see here, Franklin Roosevelt and the Democrats are going to pick up an enormous number of seats, even more than their landslide in the 1932 election. And what this does is enable these really super majorities to pass a significant amount of what historians will call the Second New Deal. The first New Deal will take place in 1933, 1934. The Second New Deal is 1935, 1936. And things like Social Security will be passed during the Second New Deal. And so this is one of the exceptions to the general rule that a president's party will lose seats in his first midterm election. Now, the pattern will continue, though, going sort of back to, I guess, normal. 1936, Franklin Roosevelt will be reelected to the second term. That's his third Congress, and he will bring in a number of seats there. But in his fourth Congress, the 1932 after the 1938 election, the president party will lose a significant number of seats, almost 90 in the House, and thus really ending the New Deal in 1939. And so you'll see how significant this pattern will be. I'll go back to, or jump ahead a little bit to one very important election. This will be after John F. Kennedy is assassinated. You'll have a period that Lyndon Johnson will be able to pass a significant amount of legislation during usually what is a period where virtually nothing is passed. This is the fourth year of a president. John F. Kennedy is elected in 1960. He's reelected in he has his midterm election in 1962, but he's assassinated almost a year before he would be up for reelection. And so what Lyndon Johnson has is really the second session of that Congress, enabling him to pass, for example, the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Johnson gets reelected in 1964, is able to pass for example, a large amount of the Great Society, including the Voting Rights Act in 1965. But in 1966, his midterm election, he will lose a significant amount of seats in his majority party. And really, the Great Society will pretty much end after the 1966 midterm election. So that gives you a sense of some of the cadence of how major domestic pieces of legislation get passed, usually before a president's first midterm election. So that's a long discussion.
I mean, you're a historian.
Yeah,
but if
I'm a historian. I get excited about this stuff.
Oh, no, I was going to say, though, if you think about, I mean, I would imagine for the U.S., the two biggest domestic initiatives legislatively, the New Deal and the Great Society, I imagine would be those two. Does you think about those, coming at least to their legislative climax or end, depending on how you think about them, because of a midterm? It gives us a sense of the significance of midterms, even though we're not voting in them at the same levels.
Right.
I want to come now to these recent midterms, and then we're going to come to the questions. So we'll make some of these power round in nature, and start with the 1994 midterm election, which is very much to the rule that you mentioned, where you got a backlash to a first-term president, in this case, William Jefferson Clinton. Can you talk about the significance of that election? This is the contract with America and the rise at the time of, kind of Newt Gingrich as speaker. What would you take away? And some of this, I want to kind of use history to kind of look at today. What would you learn from that midterm as we sit here in 2022 thinking about the upcoming midterm?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because here you get a situation where you have Bill Clinton elected in 1992 on primarily a domestic agenda, almost exclusively a domestic agenda. Remember, this is after the end of the Cold War. And here
you have for those who don't remember the slogan.
Right. Yep. Yeah, it's the economy stupid. And here you have George H.W. Bush running for re-election, but also Ross Perot, who's going to take upwards of 20% of the vote. Doesn't get any electoral votes because it's sort of generally spread out over the whole of the United States. But Bill Clinton comes in as a minority president, one who's elected with not a majority in the popular vote. And what he does, and this is where it's somewhat fascinating if we look and see what some of the major domestic policy moves that Bill Clinton was trying to do is going to be in finding some way to get a national health insurance passed. But what the Clinton administration, coming from an outsider, they didn't realize the nature of political time. And so if you look, he really loses much of his political capital very early on, and then has Hillary Clinton oversee a study of health insurance and health legislation that will carry it from 1993 deep into 1994, meaning that the sort of window to pass major legislation in that even number or that odd numbered year gets overwhelmed by the focus on the midterm election in 1994. And here you have a very focused outsider, a Southerner, Southern Republican, who is very clearly concerned about having a distinct difference between the Republican Party that he has, the sort of insurgent Republican Party, and the more maybe establishment Republican Party that's present, who was the minority leader at that time was Bob Michel from Illinois. And I had a chance to talk to him a number of times about this. especially the different parts of the party that is mobilized towards the midterm election. Now, what Gingrich did absolutely brilliantly is he nationalized the midterm election. Tomorrow is 2 months, 8 weeks before the midterm election, right? Tomorrow is the 13th. The midterm election is November 8th. So 8 weeks from tomorrow. What Gingrich did is brought the incumbents plus also the candidates, the Republican candidates, 6 weeks before the election and nationalized it by saying, we're going to have a distinct program called the Contract with America. And many of us remember what the contract was. Some of us do. But what Gingrich had done is he polled a number of things that reached 60% of the American public opinion supporting these things in the Contract with America. And Gingrich had a little contract that was boiled down to only really talking points on a little card. But what in fact it was a series of legislation that the majority, or the then to be majority leader Dick Armey, had written, really serious legislation that came into place. But by nationalizing the midterm election, Gingrich was able to focus not on individual candidates, but rather on parties. And this led to, the Democrats losing 52 seats in the House and 8 in the Senate, flipping full control of the Congress to the Republicans for the first time in 40 years. And think about it, there wasn't a single Republican who came in 1995 who had ever been in the majority. And there's some fascinating bits about how what happens when Congress changes. But a Republican had never been a majority in the House of Representatives. And so literally, Gingrich had to walk through door by door to see what was behind each door in the House side of the Capitol, because Republicans had never seen most of what was inside the rooms. It's just kind of a fascinating thing of what happens. The Senate had flipped a couple times during the early Reagan administration. And so the senators knew very clearly, and the Senate is a much more collegial body. But Gingrich, by really making the 1994 midterm election basically a referendum on the Democratic administration, was able for the first time to lead his party into the majority. And what this does, I'm thinking, it sets a pattern that you see from the 1994 midterm election. The 2002 midterm election is a different one, partly because that took place a little over a year after 9/11, the September 11th, 2001. So there it's a little more of an aberration. It's not the usual pattern that's there. And so the Republicans did pick up the party of the majority, George W. Bush's party, picked up a few seats in the House and a couple seats in the Senate. The Senate was very closely divided in George W. Bush's first Congress. But the 2002 midterm was in some ways an aberration because of how close it was after the 9/11. But the 1994 midterm election, that was a enormous sort of shattering election in a midterm that really, I think, set a pattern after that. And we could talk about that a little bit more, but maybe Seth, go to a follow-up in there.
Well, so maybe we'll fast forward, because you've talked about 2002 and how it's an exception in some ways, like 34, because of 9/11 and some of the, kind of patriotism that is at least viewed to come out of that in terms of voting. We get into Barack Obama's first midterm in 2010. And I'm curious if we could talk a little bit about that, because I believe, and you're the historian, Fred, that Obamacare might have passed toward the end of 2009. So he may have gotten that notice that, this is your year to do something big. And that was really his only year to do something at that, level of consequence. Then we come into 2010 and do have the rule again, where, the president's party is unseated. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about that. And I'm keeping some notes now on, how this may apply as we look to 2022. And I see your questions in the chat. And after we maybe introduce this, and maybe you can talk about as well the first midterm of the Trump presidency, we'll then come into some of the questions in the chat and the current. But yeah, bring us through Obama and Trump's first midterm elections in Trump's cases only.
Okay. As a historian, I want to go back just a little bit further, as you can see it. So remember the pattern of a president's first Congress, second Congress, third Congress, fourth Congress. So George W. Bush wins re-election in 2004, but his next midterm election, that's in 2006. That's when George W. Bush loses his working majority. Okay, he had a working majority generally. It had control of the House from 2001 to 2006. But in the 2006 election, Bush's second midterm, he loses control of the House and of the Senate, or his party, rather, loses control of the House and Senate. And it's really only a couple seats that shift from the Republicans' control in the House to the Democrats' control in the House. And that's going to be the first speakership of Nancy Pelosi. And I was there at the time, and I kind of watched the shift that took place in the 2006 midterm election. I wasn't on the Senate side, but it also shifted. And so here, the midterm election in the third Congress of a president, it was a foreshadows sometimes some major shifts that will take place. And so I think the change in the 2006 election really set up the election for Barack Obama. And it set up also the control of the House and the Senate, because there was a very clear strategy that actually our Chicago's own Rahm Emanuel, who was chairman of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, the DCCC, decided very clearly to run moderate Democrats in marginal districts. And that's what captured the House of Representatives in 2006 for the Democrats. And it was those so-called blue dog Democrats, conservative Democrats, who provided the working majority that came along on the coattails of Barack Obama in the 2008 election. And so it's this sort of longer term strategy, thinking that a president can't operate on his own. He needs a House and the Senate to work with him to pass his domestic program. Well, so from the shift from the 110th Congress elected in 2006 to the 111th elected in 2008, that gave Mr. Obama the working majority to work the Affordable Care Act through in the House and in the Senate. And it was interesting to sort of watch and see how that legislative process took place. And in many respects, some of the same people were in the same chairs looking for the 1993-94, we'll call it Hillary Care, versus the Affordable Care Act. And they learned the lessons of what you needed to do. The president is strongest in his first year and a half of his first Congress. And notice we've watched this this year, the last year and a half, because Mr. Biden is strongest in his first year and a half. And then after the August recess of an even-numbered year, there's not going to be much done. There's maybe one or two pieces of legislation that will take place, and I'll do a little prediction. This is now where you have to fund the federal government for a series of appropriation acts, because the fiscal year ends on September 30th. I will make a prediction that Congress, as it usually will do, will kick the can down the road to after the midterm election. So I don't see too much legislation being passed before the election. It's 8 weeks from tomorrow. They'll kick the can back. And one of the things that's fascinating that the founders set up, written into our time in our Constitution, that there's always a lame duck session. So this Congress that is elected with the president and back in 2020 will have a second shot from December and early January to pass additional legislation before the new Congress comes in. So there's that continuity that the founders had built in with the time. So I went back to 2006 because that sets up the 2008 election, bringing in Barack Obama, but the second term of Mrs. Pelosi as Speaker. But then you have the 2010 election, as basically a referendum on the Obama administration's handling of its domestic policy, especially the Affordable Care Act. And so in 2010, the Democrats lost 63 seats in the House and 6 seats in the Senate. And we know what happens to Mr. Obama's legislation because there's not much you can do. And so out of the 4 Congresses that Mr. Obama had, he had a unified government, only his first one. And then he had to face opposition in really the 112th through the 114th Congress. So that's a pattern very similar to the pattern that was with Mr. Clinton and would have been the case with Mr. Bush, except for the 9/11 2002. But again, Mr. Bush loses his working majority in his second midterm election. And so looking at Mr. Trump, you saw it. Mr. Trump had one Congress that came in with him after the election. And there, the Republicans had control of the House. They pick up the control of the Senate after the 2014 election. But Mr. Trump, when Trump is elected in 2016, he does bring in a House and Senate with him. But then very quickly in his midterm, he loses to both the House. He loses the House. And that's the second speakership of Mrs. Pelosi. So the Republicans didn't lose an enormous number of seats, but it's about 20 that they lost, shifting the majority in order to the Democrats and limiting the ability of Mr. Trump to pass much legislation, except when the pandemic comes in. And then there is a bipartisan thing based on that emergency. So what I see is a president oftentimes losing his working majority in the House and or the Senate in his first midterm. And that's taken place 3 of the 4 times in the last 30 years.
Well, so we've got a few questions in the chat, Fred, that I want to make sure we get to. Patty Peace asks, has anyone done much work on the history of changes in how people get their news, radio, TV, cable news, social media, and how or if that impacts voting patterns in midterms? And let me maybe even make that a little bit more particular, which is we're living in a very different news cycle than we were 2 decades ago, than we were, in the middle of the country history. How do you think that the change in news consumption, obviously with more of us in echo chambers today than we were decades ago, how is that influencing voting patterns in midterms to the extent that you can parse that out?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and the significance of how specific types of technology affects voting patterns is a very important one that we can go back. A president is going, or a presidential candidate is wanting to use technology as a way to go beyond the filtering process that the media has. And you could see it in the brilliance of how Richard Nixon used television in 1968 because he felt he got burned by the use of television in 1960. And so you see some of these patterns, but notice the difference of how Mr. Trump used Twitter in 2016 versus in 2018, you're starting to see somewhat restrictions on the sort of free-flowing use of Twitter. And then by 2020, really a mobilization of the parts of the platform or various types of social media platforms to limit certain types of speech using those. So in 2016, it's wide open. By 2020, it's restricted in some ways, at least across various social media frameworks. But also what you see is a polarization that will take place. And somebody has worked on really the change that's taken place. I think there's a very important article in the Atlantic of last spring, and I think it's by Jonathan Haidt, that describes one of the major changes that increased polarization. And that's when I think it was Facebook added the like button in about 2014. And what this did based on algorithms is all of a sudden you start to, and Twitter adds that afterwards, but what you get is when you like something, the algorithms will keep feeding you that. And so you start to see, based on social media technology and how the algorithms function is that news feeds become much more polarized and much more extreme towards either left or the right, if you can use it in that way. And that exacerbates some of the political polarization. But in some ways, that's a product, at least in part, of a technology that operates during the 2016 and during the 2020 campaign. We're seeing it somewhat working in the 2018, I'm saying the 2022 campaign as well, but I think there's at least people are conscious enough that at least many of them, those of us who think in these ways, to sort of counteract the automatic features of our news feeds. And as we try to refine a way to at least to come back towards a middle, at least on our news sources. So that's a short version. But yes, there's been a lot of research on how social media affects campaigns, and especially how the influence of the like button somewhere in there that have increased political polarization, or at least the news feeds leading to political polarization.
Greg Gosick asked a question I've always been curious about. Since only a third of the Senate seats are up for choice in any given congressional election, what criteria determine the inclusion of a particular set of states within a cycle? And are those state sets fixed over the 3 election cycles that any individual senator's term will extend? And obviously this influences, where you are in the Senate, because even in a year where you might have a wave, that wave may not hit the Senate in the same way because only a third are up, and those third may be in safe areas for one candidate or another, or not. And I know, in this election, even before it got closer, they were saying, it was theoretically a good year in the Senate for Democrats just because there were many more incumbent Republicans coming up in 2022 than Democrats this cycle. So flipping the Senate was going to be harder than flipping the House in the same electorate cycle. But yeah, maybe you can share more about how that gets set, if it's immutable or not.
Right, that's a very good question. It went back from the beginning of the first Congress. They set up 3 different classes of senators. And so some senators were only elected for 2 years, some for 4, and some for 6. It depends on what your class is. And when a new state comes into the Union, we haven't had a new state since the late 1950s, but you have the 2 senators in those classes. And well, you saw this with the Georgia election in 2020. You had 2 Senate seats up in Georgia, but one of them was for a 6-year term, and the other was for a 2-year term, and because he was filling out a previous seat, because that was the class. And so now there again is the Senate seat up in Georgia because he was only elected for 2 terms, or 2-year term, just to finish out that previous term of what his class is, what that seat was in the class. So every year, every election cycle, you either have 33 or 34 seats up for election in the Senate. Now, there you can go back and notice when the wave elections are. So you did have a wave election in 1994. That means in 2000, those senators who sort of carried in on, say, Gingrich's coattails, if you will, were up for re-election during a presidential year, right? And those barely brought in the year 2000. If I go back, there you've got a Senate that actually went back and forth. I don't know if people remember this, but there was a senator from Vermont that was elected as a Republican, Jim Jeffords, who shifted sides. And so the Senate kind of goes back and forth during the first Congress of George W. Bush, his administration. But that was 6 years after the wave election in 1994. Well, let's go ahead. Where are some of the other wave elections? You could say the senators brought in with Mr. Obama in 2008. Well, you add 6 years to that, 2014. And there you have a number of vulnerable senators or senators up for re-election. There's a few that will take place. And so you saw it again in 2020. And so here you kind of see that cycle that will take place, but it has an 8-year sort of trail, or tail, I guess, is what you would call it. And that gets moderated out. But I think this is by design on the part of the founders, because they didn't want one election cycle to dramatically change everything. And it wouldn't come to anyone's surprise that Lyndon Johnson, that master of the Senate, was pushing in the mid-1960s to align the senators, moving them to a 4-year term, and congressmen also to a 4-year term that would be elected at the same time as the president. That was something that Lyndon Johnson really wanted, to sync all three political branches together. And everybody's like, no, we want to make sure we have that continuity. That's there, because the American people kind of go back and forth. They give one party control of all three branches for 2 years, and then they shift around and have divided government. And we've seen that over the course of really from 1992, that's 30 years ago. That's happened almost all the time. There's been only a few exceptions where the American people have wanted that trifecta. Instead, it's kind of back and forth. Right, to divided government is almost now the norm, if you will. Yeah, go ahead, Seth. I hope that answered the question.
It answered it perfectly. We are technically out of time. We'll make these power rounds. I want to get Kylie and Thomas's questions, but we'll ask for your kind of 30-second responses. Kylie is curious about the connection between the midterms on the federal congressional level and changes in control of state government. So have we seen in those midterms where there are governorships, for example, or state assemblies, that it carries over for the anti-incumbent party to succeed at the state level?
And some states are going to be operating differently. And sometimes you're going to have state governments wanting the governor, for example, to sync up with the presidential election. Other times you want it not to sync up with the presidential election. So, for example, the state of Wisconsin has the governor's up now for re-election in 2022, because they want to make sure that the state races are not overshadowed by the president's race. And so, but most states have a 2-year and 6-year cycle for their House, the equivalent of the House for the Assembly and the Senate. In some ways to continue that. Not all states do, but many states want to have the governor's election in different ways. And notice how this operates in Chicago. Chicago is very conscious in making sure that their election for mayor doesn't sync up with any other election, not in the primary, nor in the general for mayor of Chicago, because they want to have the most motivated individuals to get out the vote on those specific elections. And so it's not an accident that the primary for the mayor of Chicago is probably the worst month you could possibly have it, in February of a non-presidential election year. And that's ways to sort of shape your electorate and to sort of see, who was going to go out in the middle of a 20 below February Tuesday in order to elect someone besides Richard J. Daley, just going back many years. And so what you want to watch and take a look at the cycles that are built into the system, but also how the American people are looking at it and seeing that sometimes the founders wanted to put in place checks for concentrated power, because in some ways I kind of like how the system is set up, because if you're in a British system, if you have 50 plus 1% of the vote, you run the place for 5 years. In an American context, if you got to have the House, the Senate, and the presidency aligned, usually for a couple cycles. And what that gives you is, a major piece of legislation, maybe 2/3 of the American people are behind it in certain ways. And so I thought it was very telling that you have the alignment in 2009 to pass the Affordable Care Act. And then the Republicans pull back and say, no, there's some problems with it. But even when they do have that trifecta of House, Senate, and presidency, they're not able to repeal it because the majority or a large working group of people say, this is probably better than what we used to have. And maybe if we all come together on something else, we can get that 67% of the American people in different ways to pass something. And so that's probably a long answer, but you sort of want to watch on how the cycles work and how wise or shrewd, say, campaign people can actually use those cycles to get what they want accomplished. I've got a little time if people want to go, or if we have one more question, or
we should close. Just
okay.
We have another commitment here, but thank you, Fred. This has been an extraordinary conversation, and I think the reason that we've had so much question and conversation is because of your brilliance and everyone wanting to further examine these issues through your, I mean, truly distinctive lenses. I'll just close by saying, like all great, faculty and instructors at the University of Chicago, I think you've left us with a lot of knowledge and no answers. And here's what I mean by that. I think if we were to actually take all of the points you've made and begin putting them up on a scoreboard, which I've been doing as, interested in history, but really curious about the future myself, I think we've put up reasons why this is going to be a really tough year for Democrats, right? This is the first presidential election that's usually a blowback. We've got some national issues, inflation that are big headwinds. We've got some local issues that may become pronounced in terms of crime and education. On the other hand, if you think about that contract with America, right, the ability to nationalize a couple issues that were north of 60%, right? You've got the Dobbs decision putting on what appears to be a 60+% issue related to privacy and the right to abortion. You've got gun control issues kind of taking over more for, and most of those poll, north of 60. So anyway, long way of saying, I think that we are looking at an election that, even with all of history as our guide, cannot be fully predicted. And so that's an incredibly interesting place to be. And so for those who came in wondering what would happen in the election, I think we've given you no answers, but we've given you more context from a historical perspective to look at, and you cannot be a better guide to that context. So truly, thank you for your time, and thank you all for your questions. And sorry we didn't get to them all today, although thankfully we will continue our conversations with Fred in the future.
Okay, thank you very much, Seth, and thank you all. And 8 weeks from tomorrow, right, is election. So wherever you want, vote. Okay, thank you all, and see you in class.
This is a better election to vote in than the February in Chicago, right? So this one, there's no excuses. All right, have a good day, everyone. Bye.
Sure.